I'm a senior vice president here at CSIS. I'm Catholic and I'm an American. I'm really deeply offended by what's happened in Nicaragua over the last couple of weeks to bishops and priests. And I think, but it's part of a larger problem and a larger set of issues around religious persecution and the closing of civic space in Nicaragua. We're going to be having an event today on the record to talk about this. We're going to have, let me just say a couple things. That recently the regime has reached new heights of authoritarianism and disregard for the rule of law. Nicaraguan authorities and their backers have stepped up attacks on the Catholic Church, detaining members of the clergy, imposing strict limits on the practice of religion, and in some cases brutalizing bishops, priests, and congregations. The Church in Nicaragua plays a vital role not only in social life but also in the political discourse. For years, the Nicaraguan Church has decried blatant human and civil rights abuses on the part of the Ortega regime. In 2020, following mass protests, churches opened their doors to provide medical assistance and shelter for those fleeing brutal crackdowns. The clergy in Nicaragua have been among the most outspoken critics and one of the last remaining bastions of opposition against the rising dictatorship. Sadly, attacks against the church due to its critical stance towards the regime are not new. In 2019, Bishop Silvio Baez left the country at the request of Pope Francis in the face of repeated and credible threats to his life. Last week, however, religious repression entered a new and more systematic phase as Nicaraguan authorities confirmed Bishop Rolando Álvarez had been placed under house arrest. The announcement came following weeks of siege and raids upon the bishop's diocese in Matagalpa. These invasions produced shocking images of the kneeling Bishop Álvarez surrounded by machine gun-toting police officers, which have sparked outrage, including with me, around the world and led to an influx of attention on the plight of the Nicaraguan Church. If this downward trajectory continues, one of the last remaining institutional voices supporting democracy and human rights in Nicaragua may be silenced. Such an outcome should be unacceptable and will only worsen the growing humanitarian crisis we are observing in Nicaragua today, where tens of thousands have been forced to flee growing state repression. What I'm interested in is not being outraged. I'm interested in coming up with some actionable things that we can do as the United States to respond to this outrage. So that is why we're convening this group today. Bringing sustained pressure against the Ortega regime will require cooperation, not just within the U.S. government, but active efforts to engage non-governmental actors as well as the global Catholic Church. With this in mind, it's my honor to welcome a distinguished group of speakers to discuss religious repression in Nicaragua and what can we do about this. So before we begin our conversation, though, I want to welcome His Excellency Archbishop Timothy Broglio, Archbishop of the U.S. Military Services and member of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on International Justice and Peace. His Excellency has held numerous positions around the world and previously served as Apostolic Nuncio, that's the Vatican's ambassador, to the Dominican Republic and Apostolic Delegate to Puerto Rico. He was also, I don't know if this is the technical term, but he was the desk officer in the Vatican for Nicaragua for 11 years. So he knows Nicaragua very, very well. So Archbishop, please come on up. Welcome. We are very grateful that you would be with us today and to thank you for shedding some light on the situation in Nicaragua. It's an honor to have you, sir.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And I'm also very grateful to the Center for Strategic and International Studies for this invitation, especially for hosting this important and timely event. The behavior of some in Nicaragua takes me back to the visit of St. John Paul II in 1983, the only international visit I can remember where those in power tried to block the message by the Holy Father, both by short-circuiting the amplification system and by playing loud music when he spoke at the Mass in the main square. Hence, for me, as for many of you here, the plight of the Church in Nicaragua, which has been enduring severe trials anew since 2018, strikes a personal chord. As you heard, I've followed the country for a long time. And here in the United States, during my tenure as chairman of the Committee on International Justice and Peace of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, I visited Nicaragua in 2018 to express the U.S. Church's steadfast solidarity with our brothers in the Nicaraguan episcopate. I met the entire Episcopal Conference during that trip and heard horrifying accounts detailing the killing of over 300 peaceful protesters by partisan gangs armed by the state. Through pictures of blood-stained church floors and desecrated statues, of bullet holes still on the walls of churches, I saw the suffering of the Nicaraguan people in their aspirations for a more just society. And I saw the valiant moral leadership of the Nicaraguan bishops and priests, pastors of their nation, who, despite all of the violence, were still seeking reconciliation among all parties. Now, 1 year after the 2021 elections in Nicaragua, declared fraudulent by the international community, because all of the opposition candidates and scores of social leaders had been unjustly imprisoned, we find ourselves again facing an intensification of the country's social and political crisis. Already under a death threat, as you heard, Bishop Silvio Baez, the auxiliary bishop of Managua, left the country at the invitation of the Holy See. In July, the missionaries of charity, Mother Teresa's religious sisters, were expelled from the country. And last month, Bishop Rolando Álvarez, after 2 weeks of forcible reclusion in his curial offices in Matagalpa, detained under the force of arms, was arrested in the early hours of the morning of August 19th, along with 8 associates. He remains under house arrest in Managua. Catholic radio stations have been shut down for denouncing human rights abuses and for reiterating the Church's call for civility, dialogue, and fraternal charity over acrimony, partisanship, and division. The Nicaraguan government and its allies continue to accuse the bishops and Catholic institutions in Nicaragua of conspiring against the country, of being golpistas, coup-mongers, for denouncing the human rights abuses being penetrated in the ongoing repression against civil society. Sandinismo is increasingly showing its inherent authoritarian tendencies by seeking to silence any pole of legitimacy and moral authority independent of the state. The Nicaraguan government and its allies, however, are not a monolithic group. It is no secret that there are Sandinistas, especially among the old Revolutionary Guard, that strongly object to the current trajectory of the Nicaraguan government. This is something that we should keep in mind as we explore efforts to build bridges with people of goodwill on all sides. The force of conscience, when the will opens the door, can break through any obstacle. There are, as you might expect, also voices that urge the Nicaraguan bishops to remain silent, even as the Church is now the last remaining independent institution of civil society in Nicaragua. The USCCB, International Justice and Peace Committee, staff have even encountered opinions accusing the Nicaraguan bishops of political interference for their denunciations of violations against the political and civil rights. Some would say if the bishops would confine themselves to the sacristy and to the church and to teaching religion, there would be no problem at all, as there are no juridical or legislative obstacle to freedom of worship in Nicaragua. While it is true that freedom of worship, very narrowly construed, is not threatened, we must bear in mind that the parameters encompassed by religious freedom extend beyond worship. Religious freedom entails the freedom to exercise a rightly formed conscience in the private and public spheres. It includes the freedom to express religious points of view, to share one's faith, and yes, to challenge existing patterns in the social sphere that threaten that faith and the dignity of the human person that the faith upholds. I can still hear St. John Paul II telling President Stroessner, the government, and the diplomatic corps in the Palacio López in Asunción, "Non se puede arrinconar a la Iglesia en sus templos, como non se puede arrinconar a Dios en la conciencia de los hombres." The Church cannot be confined to her temples, nor is it possible to relegate God to a corner in the human conscience. So yes, in Nicaragua, we have seen acutely since 2018 an intense, systematic, and aggressive attack against religious freedom. We have seen the government utilize sacred symbols as instruments of social control, such as vesting the statues of Mary in Sandinista colors, using rhetoric that invests Sandinismo with the trappings of political messianism. We have seen the continued reduction of the political conceptual space into a rigid us versus them dynamic that perpetuates polarization. And now, with the arrest of Bishop Álvarez and other priests, we are seeing the government attacking the church for preaching moral doctrines that the church has always held. Faith itself obliges the bishops to speak. Silence would be a denial of the incarnational nature of Christianity. It is a religion that values the created material cosmos and human society as the dynamic space where man's encounter with God takes place. The theological corpus that addresses the application of the gospel principles to the public sphere is the social doctrine of the church. According to its compendium, this doctrine has its own profound unity, which flows from faith in a whole and complete salvation, from hope in a fullness of justice, and from love which makes all people truly brothers and sisters in Christ. It is the expression of God's love for the world, which he so loved that he gave his only Son. In other words, our social doctrine is not just an added body of principles. Rather, the social doctrine of the church is the necessary correlation of theological and dogmatic principles that define our faith. The compendium states further that Christian love leads to denunciation, proposals, and a commitment to cultural and social projects. It prompts positive activity that inspires all who sincerely have the good of man at heart to make their contribution. In other words, the proclamation of the social gospel of the church is prophetic. It calls human societies and governments to recognize and assist in the noble enterprise of human flourishing. When a bishop denounces the arbitrary arrest of opposition leaders, the wholesale repression of peaceful protesters, the shutdown of communication networks, he is preaching the gospel. A bishop preaches and denounces, not as a politician usually does, but as a pastor and with the heart of a pastor. He denounces for the sake of the victims and the victimizers, as Christ's healing is extended to all who seek a change of heart. As the Nicaraguan church continues its painful journey in faith, I renew the expression of the U.S. bishops' solidarity with our brother bishops in Nicaragua. We are here to support your mission of reconciliation and clarity and charity towards the people of Nicaragua. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. If I may, I did one question for you, if I might. Thank you for, I'm very grateful that you're here. Excellency, I know there's a little bit of an elephant in the room, and I think you've touched on some of this. There are some concerns that the Holy See has not been more vocal about what is happening in Nicaragua. Could you please comment on that?
I guess I would say three things about that. One, the Holy See has not prevented either CELAM, the Association of the Conference of Latin American Bishops, to take very strong positions on what's going on in Nicaragua. They have also not said anything to us as a conference, and we have tried as best as we can to support certainly Bishop Baez, who's now, to our advantage, teaching at the seminary in Boynton Beach, Florida, but to make known the difficulties that the bishops are experiencing, or that the church is experiencing down there. And thirdly, the Pope did say that he follows with interest the situation. And I really am not in a position, at one point I would have been, but I'm not in a position to know what might be going on behind the scenes. You probably know that the nuncio the Holy See's representative in Managua was expelled from the country last March. So relations are being maintained through the chargé d'affaires, who would be a much more junior diplomat. But that does inhibit also the Holy See's ability to respond in a more concrete way, still a subtle way, but a more concrete way.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you for being here. We're very grateful. I'm going to ask the panelists to come on up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. Thank you. Okay. So I'm really grateful that people would come on short notice on a Friday morning at 10 o'clock. Like, why would I do this right before the long weekend? And why would I do this at 10 o'clock in the morning? Well, I did this because of what happened last week. I'm not easily outraged, but I was really quite triggered by that photo of the bishop surrounded by people with machine guns, and I just thought it was outrageous. It's hard to get attention on Latin America generally. It's very hard to get attention on Central America. We have an inability in Washington to pay much. We have an ADD relationship with Central America. And so, unfortunately, that's the case. But I think my view was that we ought to do this. And I'm so grateful to have such thoughtful people who know Central America and follow it more closely than I do. What I want to do, though, with this conversation is to say, okay, what do we do about this? I think we're all outraged, but what can we do as the United States? What can civil society do? How should we be thinking about multilateral institutions? How do we use the United Nations? How should the neighbors of Nicaragua, what do we ask of them? What do we ask of countries in Asia to do about this? Because they have a role. So that's what I wanted to have this conversation about. And so I'm so grateful to have such smart and thoughtful people who I respect very much. I'm really grateful to Deborah Ulmer, who's the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at NDI. She's got 20 years of experience, more than that, managing a range of democracy assistance and human rights programs. And she was the chief of party for a program in Nicaragua, so knows the country well. I'm really grateful to have Ambassador John Feely, who is the former U.S. ambassador and executive director of the Center for Media Integrity of the Americas. He's had a distinguished career with the State Department. He was ambassador to Panama, DCM and Chargé in Mexico City. He was the PDAS, which is a big job at the State Department, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Thanks, Ambassador, for doing this. Then, as the third panelist is Jared Genser. Jared is really one of the most effective advocates in Washington. You want him on your team. He's the managing director at Perseus Strategies and the special advisor on the responsibility to protect to the Organization of American States. He has educated me quite a lot on Nicaragua, and I know he'll have some very thoughtful things to say. So, Jared, I'm very grateful that you're here. And then finally, our final panelist joins us virtually. I thought it was inappropriate to have a conversation about Nicaragua without a Nicaraguan voice. So we have Umberto Belli, a sociologist and former Minister of Education of Nicaragua under the presidency of Ms. Violeta Chamorro. Umberto has experienced directly the repression of the Ortega regime and has written and advocated at length for the need to restore democracy in Nicaragua. I'm going to start with Deborah. I'm going to turn it over to you, Deborah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so morning. And good morning, Dan, and thank you to CSIS. And it is an honor to be here with such distinguished guests, with the minister and with His Excellency. It's a little intimidating to come after His Excellency. The recent arrest of Bishop Rolando Álvarez is part of the regime's broader pattern, not just to repress, but also control and silence everyday citizens. The regime, I dare say, is eroding the social fabric of the country. Human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers, and any citizens who dare to speak up about their salary are monitored, they're intimidated, and they're arbitrarily detained. Nicaragua's indigenous people continue to suffer violent attacks over their land disputes with total impunity. And after incarcerating now approximately 200 political prisoners, including 7 presidential candidates, civil society leaders, personal friends of mine, journalists, and former Sandinista colleagues, the regime now incarcerates priests. Combined with the economic deterioration in the country, migration has increased exponentially. I see Manuel Orozco is here, so he will not let me lie from the Inter-American Dialogue, that more than 400,000 Nicaraguans have left the country since the crisis in 2018. A recent political satire cartoon captured the choices offered by the Ortega-Murillo regime. You stay silent, or you have two choices. You go to jail, or you're forced into exile. The regime has also targeted civil society, journalists, and even charities by adopting repressive laws that violate citizen participation and freedom of expression. Since 2018, Nicaraguan authorities have canceled the legal registration of more than 1,000 non-governmental organizations and charities, according to Confidencial. Churches, charities, associations, and other nonprofit organizations not only play a critical role in ensuring access to health care, food, water, in low-income and mostly rural communities, but they also play a critical role, as His Excellency has said. The church is the last remaining independent institution in the country, and they are left to act as a check on the executive power. In 2022 alone, the repression of academia has also escalated. I'm sure the minister will touch on this, but Ortega's regime has closed eight private universities. These measures silence the critical voices and critical thinking in the country, and are now imposing curricula at the university, but also in the elementary schools, to rewrite history according to Ortega and Murillo. Even healthcare workers addressing COVID-19 have faced obstacles, as the government has understated cases and fired doctors who have expressed concern about the pandemic. And as well is known today, and I'm sure Ambassador Feely will also touch on this, the government controls all media outlets within the country, and they've either jailed or forced independent journalists to flee the country. Government surveillance and monitoring of public discourse has further stifled freedom of speech and expression. A recent Mexican journalist has snuck into the country and has documented the fear, the hushed voices. We've only seen that in 2 other countries in Latin America. And notably, the latest attack on the church is more visible now because there's a lack of independent civil society organizations to serve as a check. In short, anyone that has been deemed a threat to the authoritarian regime is under attack. And this is likely to continue, particularly in the lead up to the sham municipal elections in November. Leaders of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua have played a critical roles over the multiple crises throughout the years. And that includes serving as mediators, and they continue to share messages of nonviolent actions within their congregations. And while the arrest of Bishop Álvarez refocused international attention on Nicaragua, the latest attacks on the church didn't start this year, and they didn't even start in 2018. We can trace back the harassment back to 2008 of this latest wave, when then the auxiliary bishop of Managua, Monsignor Silvio Báez, he was forced into exile in 2019. Báez called for dialogue and free and fair elections starting in 2014. But in 2008, the Episcopal Conference in Nicaragua called for the revision of actas, of votes, because these were the most documented elections in all of Nicaragua's histories, where thousands of nonpartisan voters and citizens went out to observe their elections and saw how absurd the changes of the votes were by adding numbers and changing numbers. Today, the academic, legal, religious, or scientific, or anyone who has messages that contradict the regime is considered an opponent. The regime's repressive tactics are different according to their convenience. That can be imprisonment, deportation, smear campaigns, among other actions, with the purpose of instilling fear among citizens. In the case of the Catholic Church, their tactics are to prevent the bishops, the priests, or even parishioners from speaking out on the truth about the social, economic, and political realities of Nicaragua. Church leaders have become more visible by default. They're the last ones standing in Nicaragua to speak out. And as His Excellency has stated, the regime is not only observing probably fissures amongst their supporters and within their own government, and they needed to act to shut down, probably thinking that there might be another civil uprising. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deborah. Ambassador Feely, thanks for being here. I'm very grateful.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much. Thanks very much for joining us today on a Friday in August. I think as the Monsignor and Deborah have correctly indicated, the degradation of religious freedom in Nicaragua really can't be properly analyzed without putting it in the context of Ortega's open assault and indeed the demolition of the rule of law in that country, or his frontal attack on civil society writ large. You know, since 2018, over 1,500 NGOs and civil society organizations have been shuttered in the regime's effort to do away with civil society altogether. You can't look at the persecution of the Catholic Church independent of a context where there is literally no separation of powers. The judiciary, the legislative, the electoral branch, which is a separate branch in Nicaragua, they're entirely controlled by Ortega and his wife and their cronies. There are effectively no independent political parties, no freedom of the press, Deborah mentioned. And the private sector, basically you've got leaders of the private sector who are either in jail, they are scared into submission, and there are a lot of those folks, or they're complicit in what is the economic rape of the country. So the result is a North Korean-style regime with a police state that's run by a family accused of crimes against humanity, and the worst human rights record in Latin America in the past 30 years, according to Human Rights Watch. That is the socio-political context of Nicaragua today. Turning to the church, approximately 70% of Nicaraguans self-identify as Catholics. They are an enormously devoted nation. Santo Domingo de Guzman is a patron of Nicaragua, and you see, you know, processions in his name. There's a very strong devotional following to Mary. The list, I'm not going to go through this because my colleagues have already done so, sort of the list of atrocities and attacks against the church most recently. The one point I will bring up, though, is that this latest round, which you can go back and date wherever you really choose to sort of start the repression against the Catholic Church, but the last time we here in Washington really paid attention to it was in 2018 when there was a shootout at the Divine Mercy Church. Father Raul Zamora brought folks, young people, mostly students, into his church, unarmed students, and there were literally hundreds of spent rounds as the paramilitaries fired into that church. The only reason we knew about it and paid attention to it in Washington was because Josh Partlow, a good friend of mine and a Washington Post reporter, covered it for the Washington Post. Since then, you move forward, it's been mentioned, Auxiliary Bishop Silvio Baez had to leave, Papal Nuncio Valdemar Stanislaw Sommertag had to leave, Mother Teresa's nuns were expelled, the Catholic Church's radio stations were shut down, and the latest abuse, as Dan has indicated, and has come, I think, to world attention, I hope to world attention, was Bishop Rolando Álvarez on his knees. Let's keep in mind that it wasn't always this way. There was a time, starting in the 2006-07 period, when Daniel Ortega ran to recover the presidency, that he and Rosario rediscovered their Catholic faith, and they used religious iconography and motifs throughout the campaign to trick the Nicaraguan people into believing they were all about peace, love, and understanding. I was the director of Central American Affairs at that time, and I recall there are many public displays of devotion of devout Catholicism. It was a masterful performance while it lasted. Clearly, it's not that way now. The only conclusion that we can draw from the last 4 years is that the Ortega-Murillo regime openly perceives the Catholic Church as a clear and present danger to their dictatorial rule, and they're seeking to eliminate it altogether or to subdue it. Also important to keep in mind, evangelical churches. Evangelism in Central America, in Nicaragua especially, has been very strong. The situation isn't that much different. There's really only space for a few pastors who either remain silent or are subservient to the state and the family. For those few evangelical leaders who found a comfortable or an even profitable accommodation with the Ortegas, they seem to be doing just fine. They get land to build their churches, they get tax dispensations, and they continue to receive funding from churches, sadly, I think, here in the United States, that are naive about the situation. But there are also many evangelical pastors that are persecuted. Several have left the country, or they're hiding out in safe houses. A few months ago, the regime closed down the largest international evangelical television station, Enlace. The Moravian Church, very strong along the Atlantic coast, is also frequently attacked. And there is an open, very clear effort by the Ortega regime to divide that, picking favorites, one side over the other, favoring them again with advantages. So the regime is now retaining the passports of priests and pastors. They don't want to let them leave the country. They're not allowing Nicaraguan priests and pastors who are outside the country to come back in. They're basically attempting to shut down any dissent that they have. But let me talk quickly about, and put my old hat on as a U.S. national security professional. As Deborah mentioned, over 400,000 Nicaraguans have fled the regime. 130,000 of those have ended up at the U.S. southwest border, traveling irregularly. That's not a good situation for the United States. Moreover, the Ortega regime has allowed visa-less transit travel for Cubans, just sort of callously taking advantage of the human trafficking that goes on, allowing Cubans to fly into Managua and then start their trek northward again in an irregular fashion. And without a doubt, there has been increased Russian, Chinese, and Iranian military and intelligence cooperation that the Ortega regime has engaged in. So what do we do with this? Okay, this is clearly hostile to U.S. interest. I'm retired now, so I can say this. U.S. policy is never going to say the words regime change. That is clearly what we would like to do, or what the U.S. government would like to do, via free and fair elections. The key issue is, how do you accomplish that desired end state? And I will say personally, I don't see it happening with the Ortegas. Remember Fidel Castro's famous injunction to Daniel Ortega, never allow elections, in '79 when he lost to Violeta Chamorro. So I have to admit, looking at it, that the United States and the EU, they have limited options. It's restricted. Ortega has proven himself willing to kill, imprison, cross every red line against his own domestic critics. So working through civil society organizations, as we've done in the past to support democracy, is incredibly difficult. And you put those people's lives at risk. Covert action, which is what we did in the 1970s with the Contras, isn't feasible or productive in this day and age. The regional and global blowback would just be too great. And military intervention is politically infeasible in the United States as well. And if you look back in our history, that didn't go along too well in 1912 when we stayed there for about 20 years. So what should the U.S. do? Here's what I would do. I would go after Ortega's money. That's what keeps all dictators in power, is money. They need to be able to pay off their supporters. They need to be able to pay the bribes, etc. So how do you do that? Number one, you continue to exercise to the fullest extent the United States legislation. These are laws, the NICA law and the Renacer law. I won't go into the details of them, and I'm the first to recognize as well that there is a danger in a monothematic foreign policy that just wants to sanction a regime until its eyes bleed. But you have to at least begin there. And we have done that. The United States government has done that. I think they should continue. My second point that I would do, continue in the vein of sanctioning President Ortega himself. Daniel Ortega is the human rights violator in chief. He has committed crimes against humanity. We have more than enough information to substantiate a sanction of him himself. We also have more than enough substantiation of the multiple labor violations that occur on a daily basis in Nicaragua to justify suspending that country from CAFTA. You've got to get the other partners to do it. It'd be difficult. It's an uphill climb. In my personal view, it's time to do it. The United States, fourthly, should also have a serious dialogue with Japan and South Korea so that any concessionary loans that go to the Ortega regime from those two countries are halted immediately. And finally, what I would do is I would have the United States Treasury take a very serious look at CABE. CABE is the Central American Integration Bank, and it is led currently by an individual named Dante Mose. He has become the banker to dictators. Literally billions of dollars have been spent in Nicaragua, loaned in Nicaragua, with very loose supervision that leads to corruption. CABE raises its capital on international capital markets, including the United States, but it lends 23% of its portfolio to Nicaragua. Something is rotten down there, and I would investigate it quickly.
Oh, wow.
I'll end right there, and thank you guys again very much for listening.
Fantastic. So this is great. Jared, let me turn to you. And Deborah, I have a question for you at some point.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, and to CSIS for hosting this important discussion, albeit at the end of August, early September, right. But great to be talking about these issues, and I'm sure that this will be much more widely seen given CSIS's great presence on the internet and social media. So the regime of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has cracked down on the Catholic Church, the only institution not under his control, after 15 years of uninterrupted authoritarian rule. And in the past few weeks, as has been discussed, he systematically threatened, disparaged, and physically attacked priests, bishops, and churches. And this is part of the ongoing context of repression that has characterized the Nicaraguan government since the social unrest began in 2018 and the violent response by Ortega and his government to that. The church is being persecuted because of the critical role that it has played in decrying serious human rights abuses being committed in Nicaragua, and because it's promoted mediation and dialogue during the protests that began in April 2018. And what has happened has really showed that the regime is willing to silence anyone who dares speak out against them or who is seeking peaceful solutions, and that they're going to stop at nothing to put pressure on everyone and anyone that might want to seek a different outcome than Ortega himself wants to see. Monsignor Álvarez's recent arrest and arbitrary detention only reaffirms that nobody is safe. Not even a human right as fundamental as the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is being recognized by Ortega. And targeting this essential liberty is a major blow in a country like Nicaragua, where some 60% or more of the population are practicing Catholics, in a region that has traditionally given the church a substantial, influential role as a social actor. It's no secret that religion is a vital aspect in the life of many Nicaraguans, and attacking Catholic leaders is an attack on the whole church and all of the faithful. And our prayers go to the Monsignor and other members of the clergy that are facing persecution due to the exercise of their faith. Amid this dire human rights situation, I've been working on a pro bono basis with Berta Valle and Victoria Cardenas, the wives of my pro bono clients Felix Mardiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro, respectively. They're two of the more than 190 political prisoners arbitrarily detained in Nicaragua. Each has received 13 years in prison for conspiracy to undermine national integrity after a sham trial with an utter disregard for due process. And of course, we're advocating for their immediate and unconditional release. These prisoners are suffering horrific conditions that constitute torture. They receive minimal food, have little access to sunlight, do not receive medical care, are not allowed regular visits and phone calls, and most notably for today's discussion, have been repeatedly denied access to Bibles and are not permitted to worship collectively. These conditions, beside constituting a severe breach of their international human rights, are directly attacking their right to freedom of religion and impeding their need for spiritual solace during these dreadful conditions. Felix Mardiaga, for example, has specifically asked his wife Berta for a Bible, to which she responded by launching a public campaign, hashtag A Bible for Felix. And we all have to support this call to get Bibles to the prisoners who desperately need them. At this point, I want to turn to what the U.S. and the international community might be able to do to respond to this outrageous situation. First, it's worth noting that the U.S. State Department has again placed Nicaragua on the special watch list for having engaged in severe violations of religious liberty under the International Religious Freedom Act. And while this is one thing that is important to be done, My own assessment is that the United States government should go further by specifically designating Nicaragua as a country of particular concern, or a CPC, a designation that the Secretary of State can place on a country that is engaged in systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom and implicates a wide array of potential responses. Second, I think we need to continue to insist on the immediate and unconditional release of Nicaragua's political prisoners. They're, of course, innocent of the crimes they're being accused of, and telling their stories internationally and nationally are very, very important to highlight the specific repression of the Ortega regime in the form of human beings who are actually being subjected to egregious mistreatment. Third, we should all welcome Pope Francis's call for an open and sincere dialogue to solve this situation. That would include supporting the Vatican and engaging directly with the regime. But I want to emphasize that any potential dialogue should not be a dialogue to nowhere. It has to be a dialogue that begins as a precondition, in my view, with the release of political prisoners, and any such dialogue would need to be time limited and have specific outcomes that would need to be determined. We've seen in Venezuela, despite the best efforts of many on all sides, that there have been literally, at this point, close to a dozen dialogues that have ultimately, in the long term, done very little to nothing to change the fundamental challenges facing the Venezuelan people. Fourth, we need to also look at other ways to highlight what's happening in Nicaragua around the world. For example, the United States could, in September, with the UN General Assembly opening in New York, call on France, the President of the UN Security Council, to hold a meeting on the situation in Nicaragua and to highlight what is happening there as well. We have seen, unlike perhaps in other dictatorships, that the regime is actually responding in real time to criticism that it is receiving. We've seen recently that pictures and video of political prisoners have been released in response to the families of political prisoners calling for proof of life in certain cases, calling for them to be well fed, etc. This is a sign that we need to keep up this pressure and not relent. And then lastly, I think we have to look at the situation in the broader geopolitical context of the region. There are definitely ideological shifts that are taking place within the region, such as in Colombia and Chile and potentially Brazil later this year, that we have to thoughtfully address. One of the first foreign policy decisions taken by Colombia's Petro was to deliberately not assist in the special session at the OAS condemning Nicaragua's human rights abuses, attacks on the church, and the closure of more than 1,000 NGOs on August 12th. And the Foreign Affairs Minister of Colombia publicly explained that they're undertaking good efforts for humanitarian action in Nicaragua, and that the OAS vote coincided with this window of opportunity. This is something we have to watch obviously closely. We do need all kinds to engage in Nicaragua, those that might be able to have a channel of discussion with Ortega, as well as those that from the outside might focus on putting pressure on him and his regime. But what is quite clear is that the situation is dire and that much more action individually, collectively is necessary going forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jared. Thank you. I'm going to come back. So my question, and I know Ambassador Feely, you've mentioned this, and Jared, you've made some reference. The question I'm going to have for the group is, what are one or two or three concrete, simple things that the United States government and others could do to ratchet up the pressure? So that'll be sort of the laundry list I'm going to come back to. So I'm now going to turn to our panelist who's here with us virtually. Thanks, Minister Belli, for being with us. I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Can you hear? Go ahead. Go ahead, sir. Minister? Can you hear us? Technology's great when it works, I know. Can the minister hear us? Okay, why don't you text him, Henry? And in the meantime, I'm going to go to this question while we work out the technical issue. So let me go back. So Deborah, if I said to you, military pension fund, Nicaragua discuss, what's that? And if I said the meat industry, Nicaragua discuss, what's that?
Thank you. Yes, as Ambassador Feely has already said, the U.S. should continue to employ all of its diplomatic and economic tools already at its disposal. So the NICA Act, the Renacer Act, Military pension, they have funds in the US. We need to pressure them. We've been saying this for the past couple of years. Nicaraguan military has businesses.
Sorry, so the military of Nicaragua has money that's in the American stock market?
Yes, they
Okay,
do.
so let's just be clear about that. That's stupid. They should not have money in the American stock market. Do you agree with that, Deborah?
I totally agree.
Okay, thank you.
And they have businesses in Nicaragua. And so we need to look at that. Those businesses probably make up a kleptocratic network. The kleptocratic network are these front persons, figureheads, that are family members of the Ortega-Murillo family, their sons, their daughters, but they're also allies in Central America. Just look at the Hondurans from the previous administration fleeing to Nicaragua. There are businesses that cross over through Central America. We need to be following the money of these kleptocratic networks and need to be putting pressure on the other Central American governments to do so. And you mentioned meat. DR CAFTA is under consideration. We need to show more about what is being reviewed. The sugar imports, exports have been suspended last month by the Biden administration. We now need to look at the meat exports and imports.
Okay, so specifically, we can't kick Nicaragua right now out of CAFTA, right? At least the rules don't allow us to do that. But if we got all the governments of all the other CAFTA members together, the rules allow for them to be suspended. Is that right, Ambassador Feely?
That's correct.
Okay, so we ought to at least call for the meeting and embarrass them, even if we can't get all the countries to do it, but we might be able to persuade them potentially to suspend them.
Yeah, personally, I think it goes beyond embarrassing. We're not looking for cheap shots here. What you're looking for is for the other members of CAFTA to live up to the democratic commitment they made in the context of that CAFTA agreement. It's clearly been violated in Nicaragua.
So and we should be, and Ambassador, we should be absolutely personally sanctioning Daniel Ortega.
Without a doubt. We've done it with Nicolas Maduro. We can do it with Daniel Ortega. We should do that tomorrow.
Okay. Jared, if you were the U.S. ambassador to the UN, we have UNGA coming up. What should we be doing? How could we use UNGA?
I think there are a couple things we could do. We could, as I said, call for a meeting of the UN Security Council and have that kind of high-profile moment to talk about the threat to regional peace and security that's being created by Daniel Ortega and his regime. The U.S. permanent mission to the UN, for example, could host a panel discussion on the situation in Nicaragua and invite diplomats and media to that. And then in addition, President Biden, Secretary Blinken will both be in New York during that week, of course, as well. And so having a high-level meeting with the families of political prisoners, with them, could go a very long way to having a lot of attention brought to what's happening in Nicaragua.
Okay. So Jared, if you were in addition to the United Nations, if you were in the Biden-Harris administration, if you were Assistant Secretary, the Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere at the White House who deals with these issues, what would be some of the things you'd be advocating right now in addition to some of the things that we've talked about here?
Well, I mean, not necessarily from that position, but more broadly. I mean, obviously, USAID has been spending money, and more money could be spent, of course, to support diaspora groups monitoring and reporting on human rights abuses, free and independent media. I think that's quite important. It's not well known probably in Washington, but the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva created a group of human rights experts on a one-year mandate, which was a very important step forward to internationalize and bring within the UN system analysis of what's happening in Nicaragua. It's only a one-year mandate, though, so that mandate is going to need to be extended. When did that start? It began in March of this year.
So my colleague Marty Flax is here. I'll commit to doing the work if I can. I know I can convince my colleague Marty, who leads our great work on human rights. We'll happily host a virtual thing for those folks. Okay, Henry, we're gonna sign up for that. Okay, so we can do something on that. Okay,
yeah,
good.
and so making sure that they have the financial support that they need, this group of experts.
So the American government could write a check to support that, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So this is all simple block and tackle stuff, simple actions we could take.
Yep.
So we can be outraged, but let's channel the outrage to simple, actionable things. Okay, so there's a good question from the audience. Okay, panelists, and I'm hoping my friend Mr. Belli will be able to return at some point. Is he gonna? Okay, he's been banished to technology Siberia, it looks like. But I'm hoping he'll come back to us. U.S. sanctions have proven largely ineffective against Maduro and Venezuela. Why would they work now against the Ortega regime? Discuss. Okay, Deborah, let's start with you.
Okay, well, there have been many efforts, as our public audience is mentioning, to sanction, and there have been efforts to include other countries in Latin America to support efforts. Jared mentioned Colombia. Chile is another country that has a different government that is very focused on human rights. There is a new Alliance for Democracy and Development that are members also of DR-CAFTA, who have been calling for a review of the CABI provisions for Central America banks and putting more pressure on Ortega. There are new actors, I think, that we should take opportunities. And of course, with the Vatican calling for dialogue, we should look at those new actors and coming not only in engaging in sanctions, but also trying to engage in dialogue and diplomacy.
Okay. Ambassador?
2 points. Number one, I'm not sure I would accept the proposition that sanctions against Maduro have been wholly ineffective. He and many of the government leaders it has become much more difficult for them to live off the proceeds of their corruption. That said, they still do, but the reason that they do is because of a factor that differentiates Nicaragua from Venezuela, and that is oil and gold and drug trafficking. So when you push via sanctions leaders like Maduro out of the established financial system, they have to depend on a parallel, effectively black market system. That's what they've done. So yes, they can evade sanctions, and yes, there is still money flowing to the highest level of Madurismo in Venezuela, but it gets more difficult. This is a step that is important to still take. Just because it hasn't achieved the final desired end state doesn't mean it should be kept away. And then secondly, I come back to the point that Nicaragua doesn't have oil. It doesn't have gold. It is now beginning to commercialize human trafficking and taking a page out of Maduro's book. All of those reasons are, I believe, why we should continue to sanction Nicaraguans, and in particular Daniel Ortega.
So, Ambassador, I really like this idea of kneecapping CABE. So we don't do anything with CABE. We're not a shareholder of CABE. If you have trouble sleeping at night, we've written a lot of reports on multilateral institutions, including the EBRD and the IDB. We're not a shareholder in CABE, but it has lots of touch points with the United States. I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm going to commit to writing a short commentary on the joys of CABE and how we can kneecap CABE and make their lives difficult.
I'm going to make one request. I'm going to ask that you don't say kneecap CABE.
Okay.
I'm the old Marine here.
How about we like sprain their ankle? How about we sprain CABE's ankle?
No, the point's well taken, Dan, and I think it would be very welcome, because when you look into how, after sanctions, because let's face it, under Renacer and under Nica and under Engel, a lot of people in the Ortega-Murillo regime have already been sanctioned, and yet they still get money. How do they get it? That's one of the ways.
Okay, so Jared, the question from the audience about sanctions, why should we do this if it isn't working that great in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's been mostly covered. The bottom line is that Nicaragua is not Venezuela, and the leaders are also not the same. I mean, Nicolas Maduro, for example, allowed in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He allowed in the prosecutor of the ICC. He's engaging with the international community. So I think that one major distinction between Venezuela and Nicaragua is the impunity with which in which Ortega is operating, and the abject unwillingness to engage with anybody of any substance in the international community. And by impunity, for example, there were 10 opposition candidates who were going to run for president, and 3 were forced into exile, and 7 were placed under house arrest or imprisoned. Right? That is not a subtle approach to maintaining your grip on power. Right, and it's the reason why we were able to get the group of human rights experts created by the UN Human Rights Council, and we were in Geneva talking to many member states, was the combination of the impunity with the lack of engagement. Right, so there's a lot more that is possible with a country that is smaller, that doesn't have the same kind of oil wealth or gold wealth, et cetera, and also the impunity with which Ortega is operating.
Okay.
All that shows that that the pressure, is increasing on him and is working, and that more pressure would be much more likely to yield better outcomes in Nicaragua as compared to Venezuela.
Okay, let's see, Mr. Belli. Let's see if we can get Mr. Belli. Is the tech working now? Please go ahead, sir.
So much for the opportunity. I am an exile. I left my country June last year. I barely escaped from getting to prison because 3 days after I escaped by sea to Costa Rica, the police came to my house. They took everything they could, and the next day another group with masked men came into my house. They stole a lot of belongings, and one of them tried to rape one of my older daughter. So they became terrified, but I just wanted to share that with you. I want to talk about what to do. I already know, we all know what's going on. Nicaragua is the worst dictatorship in Latin America. Just to give you a pattern of example, when in last July, when the people of Cuba went to the streets protesting, the government was repressive, but it only killed one person. In Nicaragua, in April 2018, people went to the streets and the government killed 340 people, mostly young students. So that gives you an idea of how repressive our government is. No government in Latin America has dared to expel the nuns of charity, etc. And besides that, Nicaragua, Ortega is an arch enemy of the United States. Nicaragua received in 2019 55 tanks from Russia, and he has expressed his willingness to have Russia set up military bases in Nicaragua, as well as China. And he's also an ally of Iran. So he hates the U.S., and every speech he gives, he blasts the U.S. as the worst enemy of humankind. But what to do about it? I am a little bit skeptical about economic sanctions as long as they do hurt the coffins of the government, but at the same time, they hurt poor people. And they may not be too effective as they have shown in the case of Venezuela and Cuba and other cases. But I think there are some sanctions that can be very effective, at least in inviting to have internal dissent inside the government and make it to Ortega more costly to keep its regime loyal. One of them would be to turn the screws on the army. The Nicaraguan army has no ideology. The Nicaraguan army is glued to Ortega because of money, because of benefits and privileges. But if they were to realize that being with Ortega is less gainful than being without him, they might think over their loyalty to the government. But that only could happen if the army bank accounts, their assets outside Nicaragua, their retirement funds, some of which are in Wall Street, if they are frozen, if they are persecuted, and at the same time, those officers in the army who are more identified with the regime receive the Magnitsky type of sanctions. That could help. The Nicaraguan army will be with Ortega as long as they feel comfortable with him. Also, the bureaucracy that surrounds him. Some bureaucrats have been punished. There have been more than 100 people who have been deprived of the entry visas to the U.S., but that is not enough. I think that the Magnitsky type of sanctions should be applied wholesale to all those who are supporting the regime inside the bureaucracy. I'm talking about maybe 1,000 visas out, maybe 200 members of the government under the Magnitsky that frozen their assets and their bank accounts. That would not topple the government, but it would make it very hard. They won't be too happy to be working for Ortega, and at the same time, it will be more costly for Ortega to keep them satisfied. These measures are not guaranteed to work, but they can help. And also, finally, I think that it's so important that the U.S., the European Union, and other countries keep monitoring what's going on in Nicaragua. The most demoralizing thing that might happen to us is that we are not, our tragedy is not in the papers. I wish the White House were to be less silent and more outspoken about what is going on in Nicaragua. That considerably help the people inside and outside the country. But that's about all I wanted to share with you. There are so many things to talk about, but given that the emphasis should be on what can be done, I will stop here.
Okay. Thanks, Humberto, very much, and thanks, Team Technology, for making it work. It was really important to hear from him. I really appreciate it, Humberto. Deborah, can I just ask you, do you agree with what Humberto suggested as steps?
Absolutely. I think Minister Belli has outlined actions that could hurt the inner circle of Ortega-Murillo, not the population. I think it's very important to distinguish that the Renacer Act, the NICA Act, the Majinsky, all of these are really aimed at individuals, not at the population as a whole. And I absolutely agree. The international community, including the Biden administration, but also Latin American communities, the Vatican, we should all be more outspoken about the human rights abuses that are happening.
Okay, we are almost out of time. There was one other question from the audience I wanted to ask. I'm hoping Ambassador Feely or Jared could take a crack at, which is, have neighboring countries denounced the religious persecution in Nicaragua, and how can these countries be incentivized to stand up against the inhumane actions of the Nicaraguan government?
I'm trying to think if anyone has, the Dominican Republic, not neighboring, but is in CAFTA. The Dominican Republic, and especially Foreign Minister Roberto Álvarez, has been outspoken and has made statements about the Ortega's persecution of critics in general. I'm not aware of a specific statement regarding the persecution of the Catholic Church, but the DR is standing pretty strong on the right side of this fight. Erica Moines and Nito Cortizo in Panama have also attempted, but they've not, quite frankly, not gone as far as I would have liked to have seen them. I had some conversations with them about the recent designation or rotational turn of Nicaragua to be in charge of SICA, which unfortunately did happen. You know, one of the problems that you've got here is that traditional Latin American reticence to criticize the neighbor. Cynically, that comes out of a history of, hey, you take care of what's in your country, I'll take care of what's in mine, and we won't get involved in each other's. Quite frankly, I think that with the outpouring of Nicaraguans into Costa Rica, here to the United States, you know, the problem is no longer inside the four walls of Nicaragua, and there's an obligation to speak out.
Agreed. Jared?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not much I can add. Okay. Good response. I mean, obviously, we need the region to be much more engaged at the highest levels possible, and not just speaking out, but also taking actions. And unfortunately, the region has not, up till now, really played a key role in putting pressure on Ortega and his regime.
Okay, so there's some do-outs from this for us, which is one is we're going to do a short commentary, all the good ideas that the smart folks suggested of actionable, reasonable, simple things in a short paper. And then I'm going to commit to doing some sort of virtual event with the global experts on Nicaragua in partnership, I'm hoping, with other programs here at CSIS. We'll do the work. We'll do that. And I want to do something on Cabay. I'll call it sprain their ankle. I think I'll go with that. But we're gonna start making. We're gonna start.
Look at them.
We're gonna put a lot of attention on Cabay because, you know, I know what it is, and I figured I'm probably one of 5 people in Washington that know what the heck Cabay is, and so we probably need to get a lot smarter about that. And they're not going to necessarily like the attention. So good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for doing this. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.